Welcome to episode 4 of Smart Money Choices. This week I want to talk about a particular behavioural bias, and it's called the home country bias. What it essentially means is that if you're an Australian, you've got a tendency to have a higher weighting of your equity investments to Australian shares or whichever particular country you live in. Now, while there can be some attractive benefits to that, particularly in Australia with franking credits, which are great depending on what tax rate you're on, the home country bias can distort your investment returns and also leave you at risk of missing out on some particular returns in other sectors. It's pretty common in Australia that most investors will have a fairly high weighting to Australian shares. And if you take into account cash holdings as well, which have been particularly high post-GFC, although they have come down a little bit, a lot of self-managed super funds in particular have significant proportion of their investment weightings towards Australian shares and cash. And that's often at the expense of a range of other sectors. It might be a global listed property, global infrastructure, international shares or emerging market shares, or even fixed interest Australian or international type investments. Now, the home country bias can certainly work in your favour when you've got a strong performing Australian share market, but in the year we've just had where Australian shares are pretty much flat, unless you've been able to pick some of the big winners or unless you've been able to avoid some big losers and really have a good stock selecting approach, which, if you look at some of the stuff that I post in my articles, is very hard to do. You've had a tough year with low interest rates and a flat Australian share market. This year's really been a good example of why you need to have a diversified portfolio. You need exposure to other sectors so that you can get a more consistent return over time and also get access to some markets that in Australia you just don't have access to. As always, click subscribe if you're interested in checking out the rest of my videos in Smart Money Choices. Until next week, thanks for joining me.